All right, so when it comes to choosing your pigments, I think this is the biggest variable in paper marbling. Getting your mixes down is actually pretty easy, but choosing the right pigments I found was a little bit of a challenge. And I'm going to use what is pretty much the most foolproof pigment you can use in acrylic water marbling, and it's Golden's Fluid Acrylics. So you mix about 5 drops of pigment with maybe 1 to 2 tablespoons of water. And you have some flexibility with this recipe, and you can definitely experiment with other pigments, but I found that these colors are the easiest to work with, and they produce really dense, beautifully pigmented papers. When it comes to applying your paint to the size, there's a couple different ways to do it, but my favorite way is actually to throw stones. I really like the kind of randomness of this pattern versus using an eyedropper to create a really even paper. If you're doing a series where you need the pages to look very similar, let's say you're doing a small edition of books and you want the end pages to all look like they're from the same batch, then I would suggest using an eyedropper and laying out the pigment in a grid. If you are going to throw stones, or even if you are laying out your pigment in a grid, something you want to watch for is how the paint is spreading on the surface of the size. And when you're laying your first colors, you may find that it's going to spread and almost kind of disappear, and that's actually what you want to see. Different colors have different properties. So like a lot of the dark blues or cobalts and then the metallic pigments tend to have heavier pigment particles, and so they don't spread as much. And you'll see that some colors, no matter how you mix them, will just behave differently on the surface of the size. So you can kind of see that ochre color at the top is actually a metallic gold, and it needs to be frequently remixed so that the pigment doesn't settle at the bottom and kind of cause it to become watery. Now, when you're actually throwing your stones or you're kind of deciding what order you want to add your paints, something to keep in mind is the color that you want to appear densest and darkest needs to be thrown first. So if you actually want to use black and not come out as sort of like a washed out gray, black needs to be the first color that you throw on the size. Beyond that, you have a lot of freedom. You can choose to concentrate certain colors to different areas of the size, or even apply the color very precisely using a skewer. That technique is often used to create sort of illustrations in the marbling, and you may have seen that in other videos where color is precisely placed and then drawn with a skewer in to make leaves or certain floral designs. Now, while I'm continuing to kind of fill up my tray here with pigment, I should mention that my size is a Carrageenan size, which is a sort of seaweed extract that's mixed with water, put in a blender, and then after it's blended, put in the fridge overnight. And this is based on the Ebru or Turkish style of marbling. It took me a little while to figure out the perfect ratio, at least for me, with the size, but my mix is 9 cups water, which is about a full blender, and 1 1/4 tablespoons of Carrageenan. Once that's blended, it just needs to sit overnight so that the bubbles evaporate. Now this red and gold print is one of the first prints that I took on this batch of size. You may find that the more you use the size over the session, the better it begins to print. Typically the first couple prints are like a little bit tight. They don't sort of spread exactly how you're expecting, and a dirty size can actually work better than a new clean size. So as you've begun to kind of fill up your size and you're getting happy with kind of where your color layout is, you need to decide if you want to comb in any patterns. In many cases, I really just like to take the stone print. It's probably one of my favorite patterns. I love the way sort of the borders of the colors kind of sit inside each other, and I think it's just really interesting to look at. Something that you should know is if your marbling colors are blending, then something's wrong. Whenever you marble, the colors will always stay independent of one another. Now in this case, I've actually decided to comb in some patterns so you could see how that looks. And this is a foundational pattern called a gelget. And all you need to do is take a skewer or some kind of pointy implement and draw parallel lines going in one direction and then the opposite direction. And then you draw the pattern across the size in the opposite way. At any point in this process, you can actually begin throwing stones again, and sometimes people actually like to have the stones on top of the pattern, or you can take the print of your Gelgat at this stage. But if you'd like to go further, you can definitely sort of comb your pattern out. And what this does is it really just weaves the pigment into sort of a more complex network. And this comb is just a piece of MDF with nails that are put in at even intervals. Now that the pattern's complete, it's actually time to take the print. And in my case, I'm actually using a cheap Japanese paper made by Speedball. I think it might be a Gampi paper, I'm not 100% positive, but the key here to laying your sheet is to try and get it to hit the surface of the size as evenly as possible. If you have any hesitation, it's going to show up in the pattern as a hesitation mark. And what I really love about this paper is that I don't actually need to apply alum beforehand. It takes the prints really beautifully without any pre-prep. After you've finished your first print, you're going to need to clean the size, and you'll have to do this in between every print you take. And there's a couple things you can use to clean it. In this case, I'm using a paper towel just so you can kind of see how much pigment's coming off the surface, but you can also use a wooden scraper bar, which I think you'll see me use in a moment, as well as newsprint or any kind of scrap pieces of paper that you have. You'll need to go over the size a couple of times to make sure you get all the pigment up, but do not worry if the pigment kind of pushes under the surface and ends up at the bottom of the size. It's really important that the surface is clean, but any paint underneath, like that gold heavy paint you can see sort of spattered on the bottom there, is not going to interfere with your prints. However, if you don't clean the surface of your size well enough, you may find that pigment from your previous prints actually contaminates or pollutes your later prints. Now, I haven't found the need to use Oxgal or Photo Flow to make my pigment spread more, but do be cautious if you are using it because this is one of the #1 contaminators of later prints. Often these two additives are used to create open areas in prints, like those found in Italian vein patterns. If you are using it, just make sure you clean the size extra well or save those patterns till the end of your printing session. Now for this final print, I'm just kind of trying to show you a different angle of the process. There's nothing really in here that I didn't show you in the earlier part of the video. So I'm just going to kind of let some music play and allow you to sort of watch this at your own pace.